Yeah, so I was in the control room at the gas plant that I worked in 2017 when the cold box catastrophically failed. The explosion rocked the control room, and it was immediately disorienting. And what I learned from this experience, first and foremost, is that in times of crisis, you truly don't rise to the level of your expectation. Rather, you fall to the level of your training. That's a truism. Because I can say from firsthand, when the explosion happened, me and the other people in the control room, it's like we didn't know what to do. Time slowed down. Everything felt sluggish. It was confusing. First, you didn't know what happened, and then you see people start to get in action. They grab their hard hats. I grabbed my hard hat. I ran outside, looked towards the cryo plant, and what used to be like a nice, neat plant now was this mess. Right, debris was everywhere. Right when the door opened, you can hear the gas hissing. Just psh. You look over and you can see the vapor cloud. There was this contractor that was sitting in a skid steer in between where I was standing and the cryo plant, and the vapor cloud was advancing towards him, and he just had this dazed look because he, like all of us, were just kind of, what happened? Well, the plant superintendent ran over to him and reached in and shut it off, right? And my heart was racing because I knew that if he hadn't done that, once the vapor cloud overtook the skid steer, it would have been sucked into the engine air tank, the engine would have revved and eventually backfired, causing an explosion. And that's totally reminiscent of exactly what happened at the BP Texas City refinery in 2005, right? And so, completely disorienting. As I looked back towards the cloud and the source of where it was coming from, I saw coming out of the clouds, just staggering, was the plant manager. And so again, we start moving and going to action and hit the ESD button. But at this point, you're like, what's going on? Because right when you hit the ESD button, all the blowdowns open up and everything rips to flare. And so you heard, before it was like a pretty loud hiss, and now it's this roar. And to add to confusion, you have that roar, and then you see a big fireball, which it's supposed to be there because that's the flare, but you don't. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's all new, and your fight or flight is just like firing on all cylinders, right? So that's the environment you're in. And of course we had training, but in some ways that training was kind of pencil whipped, right? We all sat through kind of the standard training, but like it wasn't meaningful, it wasn't impactful. There's a lot of stuff that was fluff, and so you kind of checked out sometimes when you sat through those types of trainings. And so anyway, because the training wasn't very impactful, in the moment of crisis, it's almost like we weren't trained at all, because it was like, we don't know what to do. We're just like shutting things down. You go into like reaction mode. And so I share that story because, when we did the incident investigation, there was a lot of things that at the root cause that could have, if it was done properly, could have totally prevented what had happened. And some of those had to do with, not having solid operating procedures in place and following them. Some of it had to do with changing operating procedures without doing an MOC. Some of it had to do with, mechanical integrity issues with the cold box. And so there's a lot that we could talk about with these elements of PSM that would have directly impacted how that day went. In the end, there were a couple of injuries, but there wasn't anything that was serious, no hospitalizations. The plant manager, he was staggering out because what had happened was he was depressuring the cold box as an effort to, we had an opinion that there was dust spread out throughout the cold box causing a high differential pressure, and so we wanted to clean it out. And one of the methods to try that is puffing the cold box, as they call it, right, or back blowing it. And so he was in the process of doing that and had reached up to grab a valve to depressure the cold box right when it catastrophically failed. And so a chunk of insulation with ice came up and hit him in the hand, and it hit him in the side and in the leg. And they caused bruising, but nothing crazy. So he was, when we saw him staggering, it was just because he was immediately had been struck. But in honesty, we just got lucky that day. And so luck is not a tactic. It's not something to rely on. And because if one of the insulation, if you ever look at a cold box, it gets almost impregnated with ice because of how cold a cryo system gets. And so if one of those pieces had hit him in the face, he wouldn't have gotten that lucky. And just to give you a sense for the energy behind that explosion, my truck was parked in the parking lot that was probably 300 yards away from the cryo. And when, after a very long day, we finally went home, I remember walking around my truck, and I looked in the bed, and there was chunks of insulation that had come from the cold box. And so it had failed catastrophically with enough energy in it to launch debris over 300 yards, right? Just, it blasted it in all directions, and chunks of it had ended up in the bed of my truck. So now, that was one of my experiences on the operating side of the table, embedded in operations. Now, when we started Petronas, and we took a hard look, now people were hiring us to look at their training systems, to look at their process safety management programs. Something that comes up again and again is training. And so remembering what that felt like in a time of a crisis, and how, because the training we had received was just to check a box and to quote unquote maintain compliance, but the spirit of it really was not there, and as a result it wasn't very effective. Because again, in the time of crisis, it's not that you rise to the level of expectation. We hope we were excellent in the time of a crisis. We expect that we know what to do. Well, when it actually comes, that's not the case. What actually happens is you revert back to the level of your training. You go into reaction mode, and if you haven't trained yourself really well at an emotional level, this is what I do in a time of emergency, to the point where you could execute on it in your sleep. Someone shakes you awake at 1 a.m, hey, what do you do in an emergency? And you're like, I do XYZ, bam, I know. If you're not there, then when an emergency happens, it's almost as if you hadn't done any training at all, and you might as well have. So we set out to change the way training is done, because how it's typically done is someone stands up once a month with this PowerPoint spreadsheet, and they talk about stuff, and then you take a test, and half the people aren't on shift, and so the PSM coordinator is always trying to track them down, and then the records get lost, and so you don't really know how well people are being trained. Anyway, so it's this pops up again and again with all the audits that we do, and so we said, we're going to do something that adds value to our clients. And first we started with a free PSM mini masterclass. So we want people to hear about this from people who are actually in operations, right? This is not stuffed shirt people who are kind of talking about theory of process safety. No, these are people who are on the ground level, including myself, right? I just told this story about working as an operator, and so we did the free mini masterclass, which you may or may not have seen. If you haven't, I recommend it, right? There's a PDF download workbook that you can see. Go find it on our website. But the response that we got from that was so good, and people wanted to know more, and so we put together a full deep masterclass where we really dive deep into expert secrets on how do you actually make PSM not a nuisance, right? How do you make this so that it doesn't give the ops team weights, it gives them wings, right? And so in a time of a crisis, people know what to do, and people stop rolling their eyes every time they see the PSM coordinator, oh good heavens, here we go again with monthly training. It's something that's engaging, intriguing, something that's Also not super time consuming, so that you can get back to what you do best, which is operating and whatever industry you're in, and whether you're processing gas or in a refinery or in chemicals. We want you to get back to doing what you do. And so we put together this masterclass to just really pack it full of value in a short amount of time, no fluff, and that's what we offer. So if you're ready to stop with the type of training that's kind of monotonous and frankly ineffective, coming from personal experience, it's ineffective if it's just pencil whipping and you're rolling your eyes, right? If you're done with that and you want to try something new, I recommend you try out our full masterclass. And you can contact us about the pricing and how we disperse that and how it's managed and all sorts of stuff. Be happy to share. So please reach out and contact. We love this. We geek out about it, and we geek out about it so that you don't have to, and you can get back to what you do best, which is operate. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening to my story. Remember, hope is not a tactic. Awesome is always an option, and I'll catch you on the flip side.